Welcome to the Fat Murder Podcast, where we'll be discussing your deep psychological relationship with food and show you how to get into the best shape of your life through the power of habit. We're your hosts, Leslie Hooper and Raj Law. Thank you so much for joining me. Co-coach Eileen Trujillo is back.
Hello.
Hi, Eileen. Today, we're going to be talking about one of your favorite subjects. Why don't you go ahead and introduce it to our audience?
We're going to talk about how to fail.
What is it that you like about failure, Eileen?
Oh, goodness. There's so many things that I don't even think I like failure. Like, I love failure. So many people who listen, I've talked on and off about perfectionism and how I'm a recovering perfectionist. And what I appreciate about where I am in my life right now about failure is I actually recognize all of the failures I had that helped me get to where I am today, because it's actually what creates success. So I used to deeply believe that, failure was like the curse. You didn't accomplish anything, but it's actually what leads you to the learnings you need to get to your kind of destination.
Amen. I think most people don't achieve their dreams because they don't want to fail. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of consideration necessarily as to why they don't want to fail. I think many just kind of associate it with like pain. And so shame, embarrassment, whatever. And so one thing that I like to ask my clients all the time is, why are you avoiding failure? Like, what is the reason? And as I just said a moment ago, it always boils down to avoiding wanting to feel something. So the true definition of failure is really just not meeting your own expectation or not taking the required action to meet your own expectation. So I think one thing that we do with our clients very well is we're always trying to get to the root of the issues. We don't try to solve problems necessarily. We're trying to solve the cause of the problems. One of the main causes of problems is not understanding why. And if we don't understand why, we can't really change. So I think asking our clients, why are you avoiding failure, or, what's the fear there, really does open up the conversation to get honest about if that story or that fear you may be experiencing is something that we can evaluate a bit more closely. So how do you help your clients who maybe, as a former or recovering perfectionist, as you say, how are you able to help your clients through your experience of failure overcome their own fear of failure?
One thing that I talk to my clients about when part of failure is complete avoidance, right? Avoiding an experience, avoiding doing something. And so I always explain to them, like, it's a guarantee. Like, you're never going to learn this new skill. You'll never get the promotion. You'll never learn how to golf if you don't do anything. Like, that's the guarantee. You'll actually never do it. And like, is that okay with you to say that I never went for the promotion or the date that I wanted to go on because I didn't want to be single? And most people will be like, well, no, like that's not what I really want. And it's like, okay, so you're going to have to embrace sucking, because that's part of this learning experience. You're going to have to embrace the suck. And so failure is just an opportunity to think about a first attempt. Like, I used to coach teachers. And so one of the classrooms, I love this sign a teacher had, like, fail would be like first attempt in learning. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, but that's really what it is. Like, if you fail and you mess it up, that's where you get to learn, because anytime you mess something up, there's going to be a partially correct action in the attempt. And so like, that's what I help my clients celebrate. And it's like, yeah, it was messy, but like, you still waited for hunger the next day. That's a big deal. Like, that's the correct attempt, right? I'm like, now, like, let's think about trying it again with the chips and guacamole out at a Mexican restaurant again, because you got to do it again until you get better. And so I really work with my clients on saying, like, every failure has a partially correct attempt. Like, let's capitalize on that. Like, let's keep that in place. And like, what's the smallest tweak we can make to get a little bit better at it? Because every small attempt that you add on is going to help you get better. So when you welcome the failure as your first attempt and the opportunity to learn, it's a little less painful because it's not game over. It's just like, oh, that was my first try. I got to do this again.
Yeah. One thing I do want to go just a little bit deeper on is what we're really trying to avoid is the pain point of failure itself. And you're right. If we don't try, then there's no pain point possible. We just get to live a small life, repeating. It's like Groundhog Day over and over again. We don't really get to step outside of our comfort zone. We don't really get to learn. We don't get to expand. We don't get to experience life and the reward of succeeding either. So what I wanted to mention is the real reason why we're afraid to fail is because we don't want to feel what we're going to feel when that happens. And I think what's really interesting about that is when you don't meet your own expectations, the only feeling that you're going to end up having is based on what you decide to think. So if you set out to do something and you have an expectation of how it's going to go and you miss that expectation, you get to decide what you're going to make that mean about you. You get to decide what you're going to think about that. If you think about that in a way that hurts your feelings, if you say, oh, I'm lazy or I'm stupid, obviously you're going to experience some negative emotion. Mm-hmm. But ironically, the whole reason you're avoiding failing is because you're avoiding something that you actually have complete control over, which is your reaction. Mm-hmm. You can either view failure as, yes, you're dumb, stupid, lazy, whatever, or you can rewrite that story and narrative and see it as, hey, I am a student here. I'm just going to embrace the fact that when I'm new, I get to screw up, and part of screwing up requires learning and applying myself and overcoming. So I
would say the other thing that I see with failure is this like catastrophizing, this whole like the fail, right? And so we make this failure of like, I went for a job and I didn't get it, or I got fired from this job, or I got rejected, or I didn't do this. And we often will fuel this moment with like, this means I'm a loser. I'm never going to meet someone, or I'm never going to get the job I want. Like, I'm never going to get that promotion. It takes it from the moment of like, it was a no here, or this didn't work out here. And we expand it to everything else. We catastrophize that situation. I see that a lot with failure. And so if you just were like, damn, that really sucked. Or if you change the language, like, I'm really proud of myself for even interviewing for the job I think I want. Like, it's a very different perspective than like, I'm a loser who's never going to get that dream job. Right. So like, you just have to kind of think about where you can give yourself some credit when you're making these attempts, because if you give yourself the credit, it helps you from getting on the train of like, everything else in my life sucks right now and I'm a failure, right? Like, we don't want you to drive down that path if you're just like, well, I did it, it didn't work out, but at least I did it.
Yes, exactly. I think what really happens is we miss our expectation and then we decide to make it mean something that hurts. Mm-hmm. And when we decide to make it something painful, then of course it's going to bring up negative emotion. So we don't have to subscribe to that way of thinking. We can decide to make it mean something positive, like you were saying. When I think about maybe learning a new language and approaching that from a student's perspective, or an instrument, as I always say, it actually doesn't make me want to avoid failure. It would make me want to learn and grow and try it over and over and over again. So you can see that I, in that scenario, am determining what failure would be like for me. I get to decide how I think about it when it doesn't go perfectly. So success is obviously something that is acquired through failure and by being willing to fail. We've all heard that quote, Eileen, if you want success, you need to double your rate of failure. And I think that's true, because the better you get at failing, the more willing you're going to be to do it. The more you're going to expand your wings and try to learn new things and sign up for the class. Like you said, go on the date, apply for the job. You'll get better and better at kind of meeting these expectations that you have. And if failure is not meeting your expectations, then I would define success as meeting your expectations. Mm-hmm. So how do we get good at anything in life, Eileen?
Practice.
Yeah. Be willing to make a lot of mistakes, because that means you're going to be doing a whole hell of a lot of learning what doesn't work.
Yeah, I always kind of encourage people, what's the small attempt? Like, what's the piece that was right here? Like, what's the learning, right? Like, tap into that and then get better, because like, there's always a moment where you're like, okay, this was better than the last time, right? Like, if you can start to teach your brain to see that every time you potentially overeat, right, you won't see it as a grand failure. Like, I was a little bit closer than the last time. Like, I still overate, but I was closer than the last meal. It's right. A lot better than I'm a failure. I'm never going to learn how to just eat enough for my body.
Yeah, I'm with you. I feel like we have to celebrate the small steps forward, because ultimately that is going to be big steps if we can stick with it long enough. Going back to the perfectionist thing, one thing that I did want to mention is when it comes to perfectionism, I kind of feel like it's for scared people. I think it gives them an excuse to not take the action, to not put themselves out there, and to not fail, to, again, not maybe meet their own expectation. And the reason why they don't want to meet their own expectations is because they know that they're going to beat themselves up afterwards. So would you say that you had a pretty loud, booming inner critic or judgmental voice when things didn't go perfectly and you weren't able to meet your own expectations or standards?
Oh yeah. I think there's kind of like two things that came to mind. Like, one, it was roaringly loud. Like, no, and I said this to you and other people before, like, nobody's ever been as mean to me as I've been to myself, ever. And I think there's like a paralysis that people who are perfectionists get. Like, you just get so overwhelmed by wanting to do it perfect because you think there's this perfect way, and then you don't do anything, right? And so you end up being so afraid of taking any risk that you live on the sidelines, right? Like, that was definitely my personal experience. And so that's why I'm like, embrace the suck, because like anything I've ever accomplished, I sucked the entire way through that process, whether it was like being a student in school, right? Like learning how to paint, like I sucked the whole time. Like, there was just a different mindset of I was learning how to do this thing. So when I give myself permission to learn, I'm far less obsessed with like a clear outcome.
Yeah. I think we have the power and ability to make a different kind of promise to ourselves or commitment to ourselves when trying something new. If we're going into it with this mindset of, hey, I'm going to go out there and try and learn this instrument or how to paint this picture, there's for sure going to be quite a bit of struggle here. Like, this is not something that I have much experience with. And there's a good chance that along the way, I'm not going to meet the expectation that I have, and I'm going to fail. And I'm going to fail many, many times. But here's the thing. When I fail, I'm going to have my own back. Instead of bullying myself, instead of calling myself a loser and telling myself I'm never going to figure this out and why are you even trying, we're going to try something different. I'm going to treat myself with respect. I'm going to honor myself. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to learn how to take care of myself. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to love myself more instead of loving myself less. I will refuse when I don't meet my goal, or, if it fails spectacularly, I'm not going to say mean things to myself. I'm not going to beat myself up, and I'm not going to quit. So if you go into this new thing with the mindset of, hey, we're going to screw up and we're going to do it well, and we're going to be really kind to ourselves. Before we even take any kind of action, the commitment is I'm going to speak to myself like I would my best friend, right? Before we take that first step, before we put the paintbrush to the canvas, the whole goal is really not to be perfect. The goal is to be kind and nice. And so the shifts maybe the goal a bit to I'm going to really work at learning how to be outside of my comfort zone and try something I've never done, but also be okay with not being good at it, and understanding that failure is really just an opportunity for me to maybe right now learn how to take care of myself. And if you do that, if you show up in that way, you're going to be a lot more inclined to keep trying over and over again, because it's not going to be so painful anymore, right?
Totally. And I think that's one of the things that I deeply love about our program, because I was a client and had that experience. And it's what I love about our clients. When we talk about our clients who are successful, our clients will be successful, but some of our clients are successful sooner, I would say, because 1-2 weeks into learning these habits, it seems so logical. I can sit down at the table. I shouldn't have a problem with this, right? There's this brain, or your brain's oh, this should be easy, right? And then they're oh, that was a lot harder than it was going to be. But I'm going to recognize that I'm trying, right? They're the clients that start recognizing that they're trying. They acknowledge the attempts over time. They're the clients that we see these really incredible mental transformations for them pretty early in the program, because that's the mindset they adopt. Well, I'm not doing this perfectly, but damn well, I'm going to at least be nice to myself while I'm trying this. I'm going to give myself a break and I'm going to keep trying. And those are the clients that stop sweating the small stuff, right? Over time, they don't sweat the overeating incident on a Thursday afternoon when they had an odd day. They're just that was a weird day. Here's kind of what happened. I'm going to reflect, and here's what I think I could do in the future. And so I think when you operate from a place of I'm going to be nice to myself, I'm going to have my own back, and I'm going to try to give myself some credit, you're able to really accomplish anything, because you're not pushing yourself out of the rink, right? You're letting yourself be part of the game.
I love it. Yes. Eileen, I want to spend just a moment talking about the benefits of failing. So one of my favorite, maybe overplayed analogies or metaphors here is, I love the example of a toddler, or not even a toddler, I should say a baby, because babies are technically learning how to walk. And one thing that I really appreciate is all of their epic fails. They are stumbling around like little drunk, I don't know, adults here, but it's just so hilarious. And you look at those kids trying to walk, and it's not pretty. They are eating it every third step. But what's fascinating, what's really interesting, what I love about it is when they fall, one of the reasons that they're not walking so well is because they just don't have enough strength in their legs yet. They got to get stronger. So when they fall, those little kids, they'll push themselves back up and keep pushing themselves back up. And the pushing themselves up is ultimately what gives them the strength to ultimately be able to walk. So if they stopped trying to walk because they were always falling, then they would never have the opportunity to get strong enough to be able to walk. So it's actually through the falling down that they get strong enough to do it. And I think, the confidence does come from putting yourself outside of your comfort zone and being willing to fall and pick yourself up again. And especially being able to do that in front of other people, which is the hard part, right? That's where the confidence, to me, my definition of confidence is being willing to fail in front of other humans, mm-hmm. and not making it mean that you are a disaster of a person. So I think one thing that we can definitely touch on here is how failure is something that we want to include and welcome into our life. It's not something that we want to avoid, like the perfectionist. Sorry, Eileen.
Yep.
But it's actually something to pursue and get good at. So if we're really confident in our ability to fail, then we're probably going to be more open to trying these new things. And you try enough, you eventually become successful. So what are your thoughts, Eileen, on how do we get our listeners and clients to feel more confident about their ability to fail and to try new things and being okay with failing?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I would encourage people to reflect on, it was helpful for me, is what am I making this word failure actually mean? Right? I was making it mean that I'm not smart, I'm not intelligent, I wasn't good enough, I was all of these things. And it was and I wrote out this list, and it's is any of this actually true? Right? I didn't get this. And does it mean any of these things are true? And the answer is going to be no. Like it doesn't, because you failed at something doesn't mean you're less worthy. It doesn't mean you're not intelligent. And it doesn't mean that you can't try it again. And so I think exploring like what you're making failure mean about you is really important, because once you do that, you're like, you can rewrite the story. It's like, well, what can failure mean to me now? Right. And for me, it became, I got my ass off the sidelines of my life, right? Like every time I screwed something up, it meant that I was doing something instead of waiting or not, right? And being paralyzed by not living this life. And so I think if you take the time to explore like what you've made failure mean about you, you get to then rewrite your story of what this is what failure is going to be about me. It's like, I'm in the rink, I'm getting my ass kicked, but I'm living for the first time in a way that is freeing for me. Like that's the story that changed for me. So I think that can be a really helpful process to reflect through, because you'll be able to see how you've put this failure as this unique meaning that doesn't need to be that meaning for you forever.
Right. Yeah. We've all heard the old quote, I think it's Edison quote, where he's like, no, I didn't fail 1,000 times. I learned 1,000 things that didn't work. And I think that's a powerful mental shift. And that's how we can kind of look at our own failures just as learning opportunities, seeing them as, okay, we didn't really meet the expectation or the goal here, but we didn't maybe take the correct action. So we just need to adjust. That doesn't mean all of it was shit. It doesn't mean that we have to toss the baby out with the bathwater, but we can spend a moment just reflecting and see what is our opportunity here to maybe make a tweak or an adjustment. Mm-hmm. So, something that we often deal with our clients is like, well, I'm not getting hungry in time for dinner. And it's like, cool, let's look at your breakfast and let's look at your lunch and figure out where the disconnect is and examine some of the tweaks that we can experiment with this upcoming week, and we'll figure it out.
It's like what you said about the expectations, right? Like the failure is representative of the expectation. And so if you feel like you're struggling, you might also want to look at like, is this expectation too big, right? Like, it's like when you talked about like, I should be hungry for all 3 meals. It's like, let's start with one, right? Like, let's not do it all, because the smaller increments allow you to have more success. They just do.
Yeah. And the more successful you feel, obviously a bit more motivated you can feel, unless you can take on failure with the same mindset of like, hey, I am practicing failure in the same way that I am practicing being hungry before each of my meals, or plating my food, or not going back for second servings. I like the idea of failure being a skill that we develop. If we get really good at falling down, then we actually learn how to fall down really well. And then we're going to be able to pick ourselves up. That's much more quickly, right? And we'll have more confidence. So we get good by doing it often. Mm-hmm. So I'm with you. I think we need to really embrace, if things are consistently just a mess, then always evaluating the plan and saying, hey, it's normal to have these kind of setbacks. I'm learning something new, but sometimes we really do need to go back to the drawing board and look a little bit more closely at like, am I just biting off more than I can chew here? Am I just not at the point? Yeah. I mean, look, if I was a third grader, I wouldn't be taking a physics test. We would need to like scale it back a little bit, so I'm not always feeling disheartened or frustrated. It's like the challenge needs to meet where we're at in the goal as we progress. And the difficulty, it's like a dial, right? Like you can turn it up based off of how things are going that particular day or week or month. If you know there's going to be some challenges, and then you can turn the dial down on the difficulty and say, hey, this is the kind of day where I just need to anchor myself 3 meals a day, sitting at the table, and I'm going to be doing my best to just kind of hold on to these 3 things. And then tomorrow, when life feels a little easier, I'm going to turn the difficulty up and maybe add another small step or 2 forward. So I hope this makes sense. Are we making sense here?
I hope so. I think it's hard to embrace failure until you are willing to see kind of the positive framing in it, right? Like you got to let yourself fail. And once you see that you bounce back up, just like the baby, right? They fall, they pull themselves back up. Like when you give yourself credit for the pulling yourself back up, then it makes it easier to repeat that difficult attempt again.
Completely. Yeah. Well, I think that's it for me today, Eileen. I hope that this has totally changed our listeners' mindset on the way that they think about failure. I hope that they walk away from this episode feeling like, oh, Leslie would be so proud of me next time they fail. DM me. Tell me about it. I always love to hear from our listeners. But Eileen, as always, pleasure to have you on. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We'll see you next Monday. Have a great week. Thanks for joining us on today's episode. If you're loving the Fat Murder podcast and want to take our relationship to the next level, then you can become a Friends with Benefits at www.lesliehooper.com. We also drop a ton of content on Instagram, so be sure and check us out at hooper.fit and Raj Law Fitness. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch up with you next week.